Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together.
Hello and welcome back to the show. In our fast-paced, often superficial world, we're constantly bombarded with quick fix solutions and fleeting pleasures. But as any connoisseur of contentment knows, true happiness is not found in the short-lived highs of life. Today we'll be investigating why meaning matters for true happiness. And to guide us through this is Associate Professor of Philosophy Matthew Hammerton, who currently resides in the School of Social Sciences at Singapore Management University. Specializing in moral philosophy, Matthew has published articles encompassing consequentialism, meaning in life, moral reasoning, and more in various journals. So welcome to the show, Matthew. How are you? Happy New Year's.
Thank you. Happy New Year. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
That's wonderful. And tell us about your background and what sparked your interest in philosophy.
I took a philosophy course by chance at university. I was actually a psychology major and I took a philosophy course and I was immediately hooked. I was like, wow, these are like these deep questions that are in the background of like psychology and all the other sciences of like, how can we even know anything? And what's the point of it all and all these kinds of questions. I thought these are really the most fundamental questions that I feel we need to answer. So from that point onwards, I wanted to be a philosopher and I pursued the long course and did my PhD. And now I'm a philosophy professor, which is great.
I see. I mean, that's the biggest question in life, right? Why does things happen in the end? And it is really interesting that you went from psychology and move into philosophy. And in your view, what is the largest misconception about happiness?
Largest misconception about happiness? Well, the word is the largest misconception. So this is where I'm going to put on my philosopher's hat. The word happiness is ambiguous and we use it to pick out two different things. I think there's two main things that we're talking about when we talk about happiness. And we really need to distinguish these things and keep them separate. So one thing we talk about when we use the word happiness is we use it just to describe a kind of positive feeling you can have.
Yeah.
So this is the sense where I say, I feel happy right now. And that can be just purely an objective description of the world that someone's currently has a particular feeling in their mind where they feel happiness.
Yeah.
But there's another sense of the word happiness, which is it picks out whatever is the ultimate good in life. So when parents look at their newborn child and they think, I hope you have a happy life, they're not merely thinking, I hope you have a life where you have positive feelings. They're thinking something deeper than that. They're thinking whatever the ultimate goods are in life, I want you to have those things in your life. And so the phrase true happiness is often used for the second sense, right? Like someone can say, well, I feel really happy. I just won $10,000. I feel great. And then their friend might say, sure, I see you feel great, but do you think you're truly happy after this? Or is there more to true happiness than just feeling great? So I think that the first thing we want to be careful with is to realize that sometimes we use happiness merely to describe the world. And sometimes we use it to make this very big evaluative judgment about what ultimately matters in life. What are the ultimate ends that make a human life worth living?
I see. So it's more of the journey in pursuing happiness rather than the contentment that we feel at fleeting moments or in the now, pretty much.
Yes, it is. But what makes this really confusing is once you say, I'm interested in the evaluative question of what's the ultimate good in life, well, one of the possible answers, a long answer that's been around for several thousand years, is hedonism, which says actually all there is to having a good life is merely having the positive feeling in the now. So that is one answer of what it is to live a good life. But there are other answers, and there's arguments against that view that say actually that's not the best view. So it gets very complicated because one answer is just the simple feeling of I feel happy is all there is to living a good life. But another answer is no, there's a lot more to living a good life than merely feeling happy. And I guess we can get in later into some of the reasons that philosophers think maybe hedonism isn't enough of an answer for what makes a life worth living.
That's wonderful. And that's a great preface to our topic today. But before we get further into the detail, as you said, Matthew, we'd like to get to know you better. And this is, have you met Matthew? Okay, so first question, what is your favorite book?
My favorite book? Well, my favorite philosophy book is Reasons and Persons, a book published by the philosopher Derek Parfit in 1984 that really revolutionized moral philosophy. A book really packed with ideas. So that's my favorite philosophy book. It is a very technical book, though it's not the philosophy book that I'd recommend
for beginners,
a casual reader to pick up. Yeah, exactly. But my favorite literature, right, because I love philosophy, but I also love to read literature. My favorite literature is actually the short stories of the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges.
Oh, what is that?
He was famous for his poetry, but he was also famous for his short stories. And he wrote these lovely short stories where they have these fascinating paradoxes and, all kinds of philosophical and metaphysical things going on, mystical things going on in these short stories. Very famous, and probably the most accessible collection of his short stories is called Labyrinths. And you can find that in most bookshops. It's a fantastic collection, really.
Oh, so a collection of short stories. That's quite interesting. For me, I think books, right? It's been a while since I've read this book, but since we are talking about philosophy, this is one of those books that makes me question further in life and ask the whys and how the world works. Is 1984 by George Orwell. And that book really encompasses a lot of different topics of different layers of society and economics and just how we see how politics and how government run just gives us like a broader question, especially I was in high school then. So it was a really good question to start step into philosophy, I guess, for that book. Have you ever read that book?
Yeah, that's a fantastic book. Yeah, I read that book when I was 15 and it had a big impact on me. And actually recently I found out that there's a graphic novel made of 1984, published like 5 years ago.
Oh, that's quite recent.
Yeah, so I actually brought a copy and I read that graphic novel, just a different way of reading 1984. I think I read that a few months ago. It was actually great as well.
It was so good. George Orwell is such an amazing writer. And I think there is also like an old movie. Yeah, there's a movie about 1984. Okay, so that's great that we found something in common. It's been a while since I've read that book. And what movie have you enjoyed recently, Matthew?
Well, recently was the holiday period. And so my son, he's 7, and his cousin, who's 12, were at our place and we were looking for something to watch. And we tried a movie. It's been out for a while, but I hadn't seen it before. Inside Out. Which
the first one?
A Pixar. Yeah, the first one. So I had never seen that, but I watched it with the boys and we all loved it. It's a fantastic film.
It's a wonderful film. Do you know that there's already like a second part out?
Yeah, they want to watch the second part as well.
Yeah, and what's interesting with Inside Out is it takes a while for the second movie to come out. And the first round of people who watched it also grew up while watching Inside Out too. So it's really interesting for you to watch the second one because it's when Riley has been growing up for a little bit. So it's interesting to see.
Yeah, but I think the concept is just brilliant to personify the emotions
Yeah.
and then build a narrative out of what goes on in the mind. And it's great for children, I think, to like conceptualize their emotional life, which is often just unclear and blurry, and think of how these conflicts play out and how you can resolve them and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it also gives children like a personification of their emotional granularity and just better vocabulary on how to tell others on how they feel, and just put their feelings into pockets. And it's just really a good movie for them growing up.
Yes.
I do enjoy that. And are you listening to any podcasts at the moment?
Not right now, but a few months ago, I really enjoyed a podcast called Neurodiving.
Oh, what is that about?
So it's about neurodivergence. So this is the idea that, not everyone's mind functions in the most typical way that we're most familiar with. Some people have minds that kind of experience the world and process information in very different ways. Autism, for example, is one type of neurodivergence, but there's many different types. And this podcast I listened to actually is by philosophers, and it looks at some of the philosophical issues that the debate about neurodivergence, what is it, does it even exist, produces. So there's the science on this stuff, but then there's lots of interesting philosophical questions when you try to understand the mind and what's going on here. And so the podcast went into those details, and it was excellent, and I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I also have delved into the topic of neurodivergence and neurotypicals on how people's brain works. And apparently the way some people's brain works differently, like, for example, some people don't really have voices in their heads or imageries. And I found that really, wow, you don't have imagery in your head. And that's quite interesting for me. And I just delved deeper into that to understand, this is how my brain works, and it's kind of different than how others have it. And I find it quite interesting. What interesting parts that you have found in delving deeper into neurodivergence?
Yeah, I mean, one question here is, what is our model of neurodivergence? And an older model is just kind of gives particular labels to particular conditions like autism, or Asperger's and stuff like that. But I tend to think of a more dynamic model where there's just various settings that the mind has. Like maybe you can think of like dozens of different dials, right? And maybe like normal is in the middle for most people, but actually people's dials can be set in very different directions. So for example, one dial is like the ability to focus, right? And there's the normal level of focus. And then there's people who have hyperfocus, where they can just intently focus on something for hours on end and get absorbed in that thing. And that's like, that has strengths and weaknesses. That can be both a boon and also a disadvantage in certain circumstances. But then, of course, there's the opposite. There's people who struggle to focus at all, and it's really hard for them to focus even for 5 minutes.
I agree.
And so I just think of the mind as all these different settings. And neurodivergence is, well, there's many ways. It's just that your settings are somewhat away from what's typical, but you can have any combination of different settings, I think.
I really like that take because it makes me think like our brain is kind of like a DJ table with different settings and dials that can go up and down, and each DJs have their table set up differently. And I find that really mind opening. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't connect it to DJing, but actually I was a DJ during my 20s.
What?
So
you were a DJ?
It kind of makes sense. Yeah, I was a DJ.
That's interesting. And you are now an associate professor. That's amazing.
Yeah, actually when I was in grad school during my PhD, I was at ANU in Canberra. I ran a Latin night at a club with some friends. We were DJs. During my PhD and made some extra money on the side doing that.
That's awesome. I would have never imagined one of my associate professor would be DJing outside.
Well, I had to give it up once I became a professor because there's a lot of demands of the job. So.
But yeah, that sounds amazing. Oh, okay. And do you have a role model?
I wouldn't actually say I have a role model. I think I have mentors that I respect greatly who've given me excellent advice. And I think there's like great people that I like admire and look up to, like, you know, people like Martin Luther King from history who are inspiring. But I wouldn't say that I have a role model, someone whose footsteps I want to follow in. Rather, I just get great advice from my mentors and then try to live my life as best I can in my circumstances.
I see. So from like advices from different people, mentors, or just like a collective of that to make your own path. That's a really interesting take on this one. Okay, so then I'd like to ask you regarding how would you define happiness?
Right. So I think we touched on this before.
Yes, a little bit.
Yeah. So the key thing here I think we have to understand is that happiness is an ambiguous term, and it names two main things. And one of those things is what philosophers would call a descriptive thing, right?
Yeah.
So one use of happiness is purely to describe the world without making any value judgment. So I can say in that circumstance, she's feeling happy, and I'm not making any judgment about whether that's a good or bad thing.
Yeah.
Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. And it's just describing a mental state she has. But there's this other sense of happiness where we use it as an evaluative term, not a purely descriptive term, where when you say that was that person found happiness in their life, or they had a happy life, you're making a value judgment. You're saying that their life contained the ultimate goods that there are for a human life. Their life went well for them. It had the things that make a life go well for a human being present in it. And these are very different senses. And we have to be careful not to equivocate, not to commit the fallacy of equivocation, where you jump between the two meanings. I think often popular discussions about happiness go off course because people tend to jump between these two meanings. So you want to be careful to be clear on whether we have the descriptive concept in mind or whether we have the evaluative concept.
I see.
And actually in philosophy, in analytic philosophy, we like to be very precise with our terms. So to avoid this, we tend to just use different labels. So we tend to, and in my published work, say I would only really use the word happiness for the descriptive thing. So happiness to me is just a psychological state that people can be in, that scientists can study. And philosophers tend to use the term well-being for the other thing, where people would often use happiness. So we say, well, people can feel happy. That's the state they can be in. But the bigger question is, what is human well-being? What is it that makes a human life worth living? What is it that makes a life go well for the person who's living it? And that's really the essential, the important, the fundamental question here, and the one that philosophy can contribute to.
I see. So would you describe true happiness as a human well-being, or is there anything or any other words that you'd like to describe it as?
Right. So there's the concept of well-being, and then there's the question of, well, what is well-being? And what's interesting is there are three main possible answers that have occurred again and again throughout human history. Like, many philosophers independently have come up with these answers. And even today, I think philosophers disagree over which is the correct answer. But I think it's very helpful for people to understand that there's just these three main narratives we might give about how humans find well-being. So the first answer is called hedonism. And hedonism says that a life goes well for a person just insofar as they experience pleasure and avoid experiences of pain. So the more pleasure and the less pain you have in your life, the better your life goes. And importantly, hedonism says that's all there is to a life going well. So take anything that you think is good for you, and the hedonist says, well, it may be good for you, but only if it brings more pleasure or eliminates pain from your life.
Okay, so pleasure.
So the hedonist, right. So the hedonist says, if friendship is good for you, well, it's only good because it brings you pleasure, right? If you found that you were a loner and friendship was uncomfortable, you wanted to be a hermit who lived by yourself, then maybe in that circumstance, being a hermit brings you more pleasure. Well, now friendship isn't good for that person because friendship isn't bringing them pleasure. So that's hedonism. And there's something very attractive about hedonism. I mean, pleasure is a natural state. It's a huge driver of human motivation. But there's various cases that put pressure on hedonism where it seems like it gives counterintuitive answers. For example, I'll give you the big one. So the big one, the big way of bringing up the problem with hedonism is a thought experiment proposed in the 1970s by the philosopher Robert Nozick. And it's called the experience machine. And when I explain it to you, you'll see that it kind of sounds a bit similar to The Matrix. In fact, The Matrix probably took some inspiration from this thought experiment. Yeah, so Robert Nozick in the 1970s proposed this thought experiment, which he called the experience machine. And it raises an objection to hedonism. So he said, imagine if neuroscientists had created this machine that you could get into where you'd just be floating with, in a kind of dreamlike state, and you'd have all these electrodes attached to your head. And in the machine, the neuroscientists would be able to stimulate very vividly in your mind by stimulating the electrodes any experience you could have in the world, as realistic as possible. What it would be like to really experience that. So, for example, they could give me the experience of climbing Mount Everest, and it would be as realistic as if I was really climbing it. Because if I'm really climbing it, sense data is coming in, my brain is being stimulated in a certain way by what comes in through my senses. Well, they could, with sophisticated enough science, program the same thing into my mind and give me that experience. And then Nozick says, imagine if you were given the option of getting into the experience machine and spending the rest of your life in there. And you could choose any amazing experiences you want to have in your life and have them pre-programmed so you experience those in the experience machine. Furthermore, they could wipe your mind so you have no memory of ever having gotten to the experience machine, and you just feel like this is your life, your real life. You've always been here. So anyone could take the life they currently have and they could just go to the experience machine and have any kind of amazing, super duper life with these amazing experiences that they'd probably never achieve in their normal life. Furthermore, they can avoid all the painful experiences, unless the pain will give you more pleasure. Like maybe you need some pain to get more pleasure, but otherwise we can eliminate any redundant pain that doesn't bring more pleasure to our lives. So you have the option, and then Nozick says, would you choose to enter the experience machine and have this kind of artificial reality where you have extremely high pleasure? Or would you prefer to live your real, genuine life in the real world that will have, hopefully many positive experiences, but will also have many negative experiences and just won't rival the experience machine for the amount of pleasure it produces? And when many people consider this thought experiment, they say, well, actually, I'd prefer the authenticity of my real life, even though there's less pleasure. I think surveys show maybe 80% of people, for example, would say they'd prefer their real life to life in the experience machine. And Nozick points out that, well, insofar as that's the answer we give, we're rejecting hedonism, because a hedonist says the best life is the life of the most pleasure. And if life in the experience machine brings you more pleasure, that would be the best life for humans. But many people seem to think it's not. And why do they not want life in the experience machine? Well, one explanation is people want to live authentically. They want to be in contact with reality. If they're experiencing a fulfilling relationship, they want it to be a real relationship with a real person, not an artificially generated relationship with some, artificially stimulated impressions of some person that may not even really exist that the experience machine gives you. And that contact with reality and that authenticity is more important than experiencing pleasure. So you would rather have less pleasure, but yet have a real life in the real world with more authenticity. So that suggests that there's things other than hedonism, other than pleasure, that matters for a good life.
Okay, so that's the first one, hedonism. And what is
hedonism.
The other ones? You said there's two more.
So so the next theory is called preferentialism. And it says, well, it's not getting pleasure that makes your life go well. It's merely getting what you want. Now, often we do want more pleasure, but not always. Sometimes we prefer a certain experience, even if that would be less pleasurable because we like other aspects of the experience. And so preferentialism is able to answer the experience machine objection, right? So why would it'd be bad for me to get an experience machine because I prefer reality. I prefer a life where it's more authentic, where I actually have real relationships with real people. Even if there's less pleasure, I prefer that over a more pleasurable life with fake relationships. So preferentialism does well in resolving that objection. But not everyone is satisfied with that as an answer to what makes a life go well. And there's a number of objections. I mean, one objection is that people can prefer some really weird things, and we might have trouble thinking how their life would go well. Like, imagine someone who their main preference in life is just to collect their belly button fluff and put it in jars. Do we really want to say that if they fully satisfy their preference, they live an outstanding human life amongst the best lives that human could live because they got what they want so much? There was very little disappointment because they were able to keep collecting their belly button fluff. Or what about a murderer, a serial killer, a sociopath, who their preference is to kill as many people as they can and get away with it? And they live that life. They kill hundreds of people. They died peacefully in old age, never being caught. Do they live a great human life? And again, some philosophers say, well, maybe not. Maybe they got what they want, but there's more to living a good life than getting what you want. And another objection to preferentialism actually is that people sometimes adapt their preferences to their circumstances. So imagine someone who's living in poverty and really poor circumstances, and maybe people around them tell them they're nothing and they won't amount to much. And so they have very modest preferences. Maybe all they want is like a small meal each day and to get by and whatever. And their preferences get satisfied. Does that mean their life's going well? And one answer might be no, their life's not going well. Even though they got what they wanted, there's so much more that they could have in their life. So this leads to the third theory that some philosophers put forward. And this theory is called objectivism about well-being. And it says, well, to live a good life is not merely a subjective thing. It's not merely about having a certain feeling or getting what you want. There's certain objective criteria you have to meet to live a good life. So it says certain things just make human lives go better. Like maybe friendship is just or human companionship is an objective good in human lives. And even if you didn't care for it or it didn't give you pleasure, it's just a good thing to have in your life. Or maybe like moral goodness, like, you know, being a good person who's kind to others, that's objectively good and makes your life go better. And even if you were a sociopath or a selfish person who didn't care for others and could take pleasure from just focusing on yourself, you still wouldn't be living a good life if you don't objectively meet the standard of having kindness towards others. So that's objectivism. And so that resolves a lot of the problems with the other theories, but it involves a big assumption that there's this kind of objective value in the world that sets what human beings should do and that our lives have to meet up with it.
Yeah. And
that's kind of mysterious, and many philosophers worry how we could justify that. How does that fit into our understanding of the world that we have from, you know, modern science, for example? How could there be these objective values floating somewhere in the world? I mean, God is one way to get there, right? If you're religious, you believe in God, you might think that God sets the objective values. But if you don't have that view, then it's hard to think what would ground these objective values.
Yes, finding those objective values and set it as a ground for what is the good of all humanity and what human well-being should be.
Yes.
Yeah. And secondarily, how would you define meaning in life?
Good. Yeah. So meaning in life, I think it's useful to think of it as having three key components. So the first one is purpose. The second one is mattering. And the third one is intelligibility. So let's go through these one by one. So first of all, purpose. So one thing that a meaningful life needs is it needs to have a purpose. It needs to have some goal that the agent endorses, the person living the life endorses, that they guide their life by. And one way for a life to lack meaning is simply for it to lack purpose. So, you know, people who feel lost, who just don't have motivation, don't know what they're doing or where they're going in their life, people who feel bored or depressed, that's one way to fail to have a meaningful life. You don't have a purpose. So that's one component. But a second component is mattering. So we don't just need to have a purpose in life. We need our purpose to matter, to be significant, to make a difference,
to make an impact,
bring value to make an impact to the world beyond ourselves. So imagine someone who has a purpose in their life, and their purpose is just to pursue their own personal gratification. And they're very selfish, and they do this. Have they lived a meaningful life? Well, arguably not, right? Arguably, although they've had this purpose that's guided them, they've been focused on themselves. Their life actually hasn't mattered or made a difference. And so they're missing something. It's not very meaningful. Indeed, someone who was living like this may have an epiphany where they realize, well, I've been living like this, but my life has not really mattered or made any difference. I feel like it's been meaningless, and they might change their ways and devote themselves to things that they think actually matter and make a difference. So that's mattering. And then the third component is intelligibility. So this is about our lives making sense to us by our life and its different components and parts fitting together in a kind of narrative where we can see ourselves as an agent going through life who's building from our past experiences, and what we're doing now kind of fits in with what we were doing before. And maybe we learn from our mistakes, or we build on what we did before in these kinds of ways. And so our life becomes intelligible to us in that sense. And someone who lacks this source of meaning in their life would feel disorientated. Maybe they see like they have projects they just jump between and they had some purposes somewhere, but it doesn't actually make sense. It doesn't hang together well. So they have a feeling of disorientation with their life. And so a meaningful life would involve all three elements coming together. You have a purpose. Your purpose contributes to something that you can see as mattering. And this fits into your life in a way that's intelligible to you and makes sense.
So making sense. So intelligibility is making sense of our purpose and why our impact matters.
Yes.
I see. And how would you describe the relationship between happiness or human well-being and meaning in life?
Yeah, this one gets tricky because as we were discussing before, there's different views of what human well-being is.
Yeah.
So maybe let me try it this way. Let's start with hedonism, right? So suppose that hedonism was true. Like suppose you weren't convinced by the experience machine or experiment I gave you before, and you thought, no, all there is to living a good life
is having pleasure.
Having pleasure. Well, how does well-being in that sense fit with meaning in life? Well, meaning in life seems to go beyond that, right? Because meaning in life says, well, your life actually has to matter and be significant and make a difference. But pleasure is not necessarily connected to that. So we can imagine if that's what well-being is, we can imagine a life that has lots of pleasure and yet is not meaningful. You can imagine someone who is passively being stimulated and having all this pleasure going in, but they don't actually have a purpose. They don't actually have a big goal they're working on that they're pursuing that's giving their life meaning, although they are experiencing all this pleasure. Or you could imagine someone whose purpose is to pursue their own self-gratification. And so although they get a lot of pleasure, their life doesn't matter in the sense of contributing to other things. And so they lack meaning in that sense. So if you're a hedonist, then well-being and meaning in life are going to come apart, and they're kind of two separate things. And some hedonists have had that view and said, well, hedonism is the best view of human well-being, but maybe there's more that matters to a human life than just well-being, and maybe we also want to live meaningful lives. And so we should sometimes be concerned with things other than pleasure. But let me compare that now with the objectivist view of human well-being. So this is the view that says for a human life to go well, a human needs to realize in their life various objective goods. They need like friendships, they need knowledge, they need to understand the world in some kind of way. They need to experience beautiful things and appreciate the beauty in nature and in the world and those kinds of things. And if we look at meaning in life, now they look pretty similar, right?
Yeah,
because
it does.
Meaning in life, when you say you need a purpose and you need things that matter, well, if you're doing all the objectively good things, you seem to then be doing the stuff that matters and having meaning in life. So actually there's a question here if you're an objectivist about whether well-being and meaning in life really are distinct things or whether they're reduced to the same thing. And there's an ongoing debate about this. And this is where I can jump in and tell you what my contribution is to this debate.
Yeah.
So I've argued in the philosophical literature for an account of how an objectivist might separate meaning in life from well-being. And my account is based on the importance of balance, right? So when you think about what it would be to have a life go well for you, and you think, well, maybe there's these objective goods that, and if you can achieve all these things and have them in your life to some degree, your life is going well. You can actually say, well, is it enough? Should we just want to get the greatest quantity of objective goods in our life? Or should we also want a good balance of objective goods, right? So compare someone who maybe they devote themselves to moral leadership and they lead their community through a difficult period and they're solely devoted to that. So they achieve really great in terms of the objective good of, say, moral excellence. But by being devoted to this, they kind of put aside their personal relationships. So they don't really have strong friendships. So they sacrifice some of that to do so well in terms of their moral leadership.
Yeah.
And maybe they don't have time to appreciate beautiful things and because they're too focused on their project and maybe they don't have time to build their knowledge of the world adequately. So they have a lot of one objective good, but very little of the others. And now compare that with a life that has a medium amount of all the objective goods. It's well balanced.
Yeah.
It has a bit of this, a bit of that. And maybe both these lives have the same amount of good in them overall, but which would be the better life for a person to live? Well, I think it's intuitive that the well-balanced life is better. It's the more desirable life, right? If we could choose, rather than being excellent at one thing and very poor in everything else, would rather have a well-balanced life where we have a good level of everything, can get to experience what all the different facets of human experience that there are, beautiful things and knowledge and relationships and loving people and all these things in reasonable doses. So that makes sense for well-being. But then I argue when you look at meaning in life, this is less appealing. So it seems like meaning in life is just about having the greatest significance you can have. And one reason for thinking this is, philosophers when they think about meaning in life, they like to ask, well, what are our paradigm cases for the most highly meaningful human lives or the most meaningless lives that someone could live? And a paradigm case for a highly meaningful life would be, people who've done great things like Gandhi or Martin Luther King or great artists like Frida Kahlo. These people have lived highly meaningful lives by devoting themselves to their projects and producing, great levels of values. Like in the case of the artists, they produce great levels
in the
of
humanity.
Beauty right. And these lives tend to be very narrow-minded lives, very focused lives on one thing at the expense of others. They're often quite unbalanced, and yet they're highly meaningful. So my theory, but there's many, many different accounts of this, but my theory is that what separates well-being from meaning in life is that they both may start with the same goods if you're an objectivist about well-being, but well-being is about having a nice balance of those goods in your life, whereas meaning in life often can come from just doing the greatest good you can, even if that means focusing on one good and sacrificing the others for it.
That's really wonderful. And thank you for giving us our take on this debate, because I was about to ask that question. And that's a really wonderful take on having a well-balanced life in balancing well-being and pursuing the meaning in life. And in what ways has the rise of social media, do you think, and instant gratification affected our ability to find deeper meaning and pursuing that meaning?
Yeah, there's many aspects to this, and I'm not an expert on social media, so some of this is just my personal opinion. But one thing I'd emphasize is judging ourselves by internal standards versus external standards. So I think that one thing that social media has exacerbated is the human tendency to constantly compare ourselves to others and look for approval from others, look for others say, that's great and you're doing well and we admire you for what you're doing, and then judge our worth or the quality of what we're doing or the value of our life by that external validation we get from others. And I think that's often detrimental to both well-being and meaning in life. I think although we want to get feedback from others and look at our society and see what it thinks, we can't be too tied to that. We have to be willing to have our own internal standards of what matters, what our values are, what we think is most important for us. And if we achieve those standards, we should be satisfied with our lives, even if, we're being told externally, well, you're not good enough, or you're not beautiful enough, or whatever else. So that's one negative effect I think that social media has had.
Yeah. And having those external outputs sometimes affect in our pursuit of meaning. And what other challenges do you think people typically face in pursuit of meaning in their lives?
This one's harder for me to answer because I think this is very much an empirical question. And so a philosopher is going to try to clarify the concepts here, the big value concepts, and kind of think about the basic value questions. But then beyond that work, there's these empirical questions about, well, as a matter of human nature and human psychology, what things in practice tend to help people, find meaning or in their lives, or tend to help people to, have positive emotions and those kinds of things. So these are questions that I'm less well equipped to answer.
I see. And maybe what are the various avenues in which people may realize like their meaning in life, or in this case, your personal meaning in life, and how you pursue that?
Right. Okay. So one way to think about this is you might think of different life domains that we have. So one life domain is work, right? So most people spend a lot of time at work.
Yep.
Some people love their jobs. Some people hate their jobs.
Yeah, indeed.
Many people, particularly in affluent societies, aspire to have a job that they find meaningful, where they do work that they think is valuable and makes an important contribution. And so many people find meaning through their work. But that's one aspect of life.
Yes.
And there's a phenomenon called workism that has recently been named. And workism is the phenomena of people primarily getting their identity and meaning from their work, as opposed to other sources that you may get meaning and identity from. So that's one area that you may find meaning. But there's other things, for example, relationships and family is another big source of meaning. And other sources are, your community and maybe volunteer work or projects you do. Maybe you work on a community garden or something like that, and you find that quite meaningful, or you volunteer and visit elderly people or stuff like that. Or people have hobbies that they do outside of their work as well. Maybe they're into a sport, they do rock climbing every weekend and they live for this weekend hobby. So these are all sources of meaning that people have in their life. And one interesting question that comes up here is it more ideal to have a well-balanced life where you find meaning in these different sources? Like you get some meaning from work, but you don't solely focus on work for your meaning. You also have relationships and family and stuff like that, and you get some meaning from that. And maybe you're also connected to your community and you get some meaning from that. Is that ideal, or is it okay to live a life where you focus on one domain where most of your meaning comes from your work? Or maybe you are a stay-at-home parent and you look after your children and you're very devoted to that and you get a lot of meaning from that. And that's where you get most of your meaning, for example.
Conversely, I've always been skeptical about, pursuing the common ways to obtain meaning in life. Like selfless work, for example, is often cited as a surefire way to find meaning in life, yet it's always seemed disingenuous to perform selfless work for the sake of myself, because if it is to make myself feel good, does that actually mean that it is selfless? And as American writer Joseph Campbell said, life has no meaning. Each of us has meaning and we bring it to life. Well, I believe there is value in selfless work with Campbell's writing in mind. Finding meaning in life seems to be less about what we do and more about the meaning we attach to it. What are your thoughts and views on this?
Thanks. Yeah, there's a lot to that question. It's an interesting question. So one thing I think is quite important, and it's in that question, is what we might pursue. If we have a goal, how we might pursue it. And there's a very interesting thing called, it applies to well-being, but it also applies to meaning. In the well-being case, it's called the paradox of happiness.
Yes.
Yeah, and the paradox of happiness is the observation, and it has been somewhat confirmed by some empirical research that's been done on this, but it's an observation originally made by philosophers several hundred years ago. The observation that if you make your goal to be happy or to have high well-being, and then you do things for the sake of that, you say, well, I heard that this will make me happier, so I'm going to do this. That tends to be counterproductive. It tends to not actually make you happy. Mm-hmm. And the things that can make our lives go well for us or make us happy or contribute to our well-being, they tend to be things that you need to do for their own sake and not do for the sake of trying to be happy or have higher well-being, whatever. So imagine someone who's painting a beautiful painting, right? And they're painting it because they think, well, I have this talent, and if I can make this beautiful painting, my life will be so much more meaningful. And arguably that kind of defeats some of the meaning there because they're doing it with this kind of bad motive in a way. Compare that with someone who's painting a beautiful painting for its own sake because they're relishing in the beauty they're creating. And they love the idea of sharing this beauty with others, creating some novel, beautiful thing that others can experience and share. That seems much more meaningful way to produce a beautiful painting than doing it with this ulterior motive that it will make you happy or bring you fame or fortune or make your life meaningful or something like that. So the paradox reflects the fact that doing things by recognizing their own value tends to be what makes lives meaningful or makes lives go well for the people who live them. So then the lesson here is not to get too caught up in the pursuit of happiness or the pursuit of meaning. Rather, what we want to do is find the things that we think have value and significance in our lives and then love and enjoy those things and spend time in those things. Like pursue relationships because you value the relationship, you value the person there, you think that it's just are good in itself to have such a strong, meaningful relationship with someone. Don't pursue relationships because you think it will make your life more meaningful or make you more happy or stuff like that. And as a byproduct of pursuing relationships with the right motive, it will then probably make you more happy and will then probably make your life more meaningful as well. So that's one of the lessons here.
I see. So in essence, it is a question to ourselves as well, and to find what do we actually find enjoyable and wonderful in our pursuit of happiness. Because in essence, if we continue to just try to pursue this happiness or human well-being as is, it will become something that we can get caught up into.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely right for happiness. And then in the case of meaning, it would be, well, you have to come to your own considered judgment about what things you think really matter and are significant and what sorts of value you see in the world beyond yourself and your own gratification. And then after you make that judgment, you should then pursue those things because you do think they really matter and they're valuable. And then as a byproduct of that, if you pursue those things, then your life will become more meaningful.
You see. And in fast-paced and highly competitive environments like Singapore, there's often a conflation between what society deems successful and true happiness. This tends to lead to high levels of stress and burnout. And in these situations, what is your advice for people who are seeking meaning in life and true happiness or human well-being?
Yeah, it's true. And yeah, in Singapore, we have this thing we call kiasu culture where
ambitious.
Everyone's trying to get ahead. Yeah, very ambitious. And people feel pressure. Even people who don't feel like they need to do it. They then look around and see everyone else is doing it. They're like competing. They're trying to get their children in the best schools to get ahead. And I need to do the same thing or I'll fall behind. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of social pressure that people feel. And actually, I think it's a source of unhappiness. I think this can drag people down. And also, it can lead people to get caught up with superficial things. So what to do about this? Well, I think we have to be willing to think for ourselves, right? And make our own judgments, to step back from our lives and think, what are my values? What do I really value? And not just passively accept whatever values we're given. Now, we should also consider the answers that, all the great thinkers throughout history have given, and consider advice from people we respect and our mentors and stuff like that. But we should ask these questions for ourselves. And we should be willing to go against what's the typical norm and opt out of the rat race if we think that's what will actually make our life most meaningful. It's a hard thing to do, but I think that's the key thing here. We have to be willing to do that. And often if you do that, it's not like you're alone. You'll find that there's communities of people who don't think that you need to pursue this kind of life or, upgrade and amass as much wealth as you can, but, rather value doing like engaging with people, doing community work, whatever. You can like do some volunteer work and find these kinds of people and connect with them. And then you'll have your own social community without having to be part of this very competitive rat race.
In university, I used to study in Singapore as well, and it is quite a fast-paced situation, and everyone is kiasu, as you mentioned. They're very ambitious in achieving their goals, and oftentimes when you have not found what your meaning in life is, it gets you caught up in this thought, especially with this external forces and comparing yourself with others. You feel taken aback. And sometimes it's just difficult to take a step back and to think further, asking ourselves internally on what is the meaning in life, and what habit would you recommend practicing in pursuit of meaning in life?
Yeah. So unfortunately, I don't think there's an easy answer here. I don't think there's like, you just do this thing on a regular basis and then your life will be more meaningful. And there's two issues here, right? One we touched on before, which is the paradox of happiness. So it's one of those things where you can't, sometimes trying to consciously pursue it will be counterproductive. And so if you say, I'm going to do this thing because I think it will make my life more meaningful, it may actually not make your life more meaningful because you're doing it for that reason. And the second thing here is I think that there's a lot of individual variation here. And so different people with different abilities and talents and aptitudes might find very different ways suit them to, find meaning in their life. Some people might find that being more focused on work works for them. Other people might find that a more balanced life that, has family and relationships just as important as work is better for them. So given all that, my advice here is actually not to do some daily or weekly habit, but just to periodically in your life, take a step back, right? Step back from what you're doing and spend some time thinking about what values your immediate daily short-term goals and medium-term goals are serving, right? What's the point of it all? Why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you pursuing this career? Why do you want to get this promotion? Why do you want to reach this point? And just reaffirm for yourself whether the value that supports it really is there and whether you really do stand behind that value. And often the answer will be yes. Actually what I'm doing makes sense. I really think it matters that I can do this or contribute in this way or achieve this thing. But people do sometimes just get stuck by force of habit in pursuing certain medium-term goals or short-term goals without, while forgetting what ultimately matters. And sometimes their daily pursuits drift away from the ultimate values
that they have,
that they endorse, that would kind of recommend what they should do in their life. So basically, I'm suggesting that people periodically stop and do some philosophical reflection on what are their ultimate values, and then just see if they need to readjust anything in their life to redirect things towards what really matters.
That really is an enticing answer, especially in terms of periodically taking a step back and how people should take a philosophical self-reflection on themselves and their values and their pursuit of happiness and meaning, because not everyone has the same periods. Some may do it daily, some may do it weekly or yearly even, because some people can get caught up in their pursuit of their short term and medium term. And I feel like that is a really wonderful answer to our question over there. And maybe last question, based on your experience, how do you do it yourself?
How do I do it myself? Well, that's still a work in progress. I'm someone who not only periodically stops to ask myself those questions, my career is asking those questions in a broader sense and thinking about all kinds of human lives and what kind of value is present. So unfortunately, there's no like simple formula or answer I have, but I'm just going through life with these questions in mind. And one thing I like to do, which I find helpful. So self-reflection is very important. And yet it's hard to honestly self-reflect and get a sense of who we are and what we're doing. So one thing I find helpful, if you have someone in your life, maybe a partner, for example, who you think really understands you and you can really trust them, I like to periodically talk to my partner and say, where do you think I'm at and how do you think I'm going and how would you judge that I'm doing with respect to A or B? Because, we all have an egocentric bias that sometimes makes it hard for us to see the truth. And sometimes when I do that, the answer I get like confirms what I already thought, but sometimes I get a very different answer from the answer I would give. And it's from someone I trust and respect. And I think, well, there's something to that. I've actually missed something here. Maybe I haven't noticed that I've been slipping in this respect and could do better here. And then that's a process for me to work on myself and see where I need to improve.
Thank you very much for your answer. And I feel like that's a really good closing to our topic. And now we can go further into our open mic. And you have the chance to talk about anything that you're passionate about. And it doesn't really have to be related to the topic. And it can be related to the topic.
Sure. Well, let's go back to the topic of workism, which I think is an interesting one. And it's actually one that I've recently written an article on, and now I'm writing a book on this topic. You've heard of the term workism before?
Yeah, when people are so focused in their work and it becomes pretty much what they are and their whole pursuit.
Right. Yeah, so the Atlantic journalist Derek Thompson wrote an article, I think it was in 2019, that went viral, where he coined the term workism. And he said workism is becoming the new religion of Americans, where they worship their workplace and want to find their meaning and purpose in their workplace. Very influential article. And he suggested that for most of human history, work has either been a necessary toil that people have to do to get by, or one of many different sources of meaning and identity that people have in their life, alongside things like, community and religion and family and those kinds of things. And Thompson suggests that has recently been changing, that there's a recent trend where people, for example, young people might be choosing not to have families at all, not have kids, and just focus on their careers, and people are doing less and less engaging in their community, doing community service, stuff like that. People are more just focused narrowly in their career. They're more and more meeting people. Their friends now more and more come from their workplace. They're meeting their partners at their workplace. And their lives are so centered around work. And Thompson suggests that this is a bad thing. He says that this has all kinds of negative consequences, and we should be deeply concerned about this trend towards workism. So that's Thompson's view. And well, let me give my personal reaction. So as someone who personally has chosen to live a very well-rounded life where I insist on good work-life balance, I have my work that's important to me.
Yes.
But I have my family as well. And I make sure I always have time for my family and put my family first in many situations. And I have other causes that I care about outside of my work, and I put effort into those. So in Thompson's sense, I'm not a workist. So when I first read this article, I thought, damn right, this is correct. Like, people should live more like me. They shouldn't be so focused on work.
Yeah,
and of course,
I agree.
There are high achievers who are achieving much, achieving much more than I am because they're so focused on work. So it's easy for someone in my position to think this is right. Like, people should be more like me. So that was my intuitive reaction. But then I put on my philosopher's hat. Good philosopher's trick actually is anytime you're inclined to believe something, immediately play devil's advocate, because you can easily fall into the trap of just confirmation bias, seeing all the evidence that supports what you believe.
Cherry picking. Yeah.
Right. So I said, well, that's what seems correct to me. But wait a minute, let me now pretend that I want to show that Thompson's theory is not correct. Like, suppose I wanted to defend that workism is a legitimate way of life. It's not such a bad thing if people want to live that kind of lifestyle. And so I started looking into the arguments and seeing if I could philosophically critique them. And what I found is actually I could. I thought, wait a minute, there's some good comebacks, some good responses to some of the objections that are being raised here against workism. So that led me to write my article, What is Wrong with Workism, that goes through, identify three main objections. And I argue that actually each one is not as convincing as it initially seems. And workism is probably an acceptable way to live a life. And now I'm writing a book on this topic, and it goes into a lot of tangents as well on things like the future of work and stuff like that. But yeah, that's this idea I have about workism. So maybe it's not as bad as people say it is.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And we get to understand the different takes on work and workism and work-life balance, because that is a really big question that people are asking in today's day and age. Thank you, Matthew, for joining us today and giving ourselves more questions and answers to think about after we go home, and for our listeners. And if our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
They can go to my LinkedIn page, and they can also, if they want to read some of my papers, philosophers, we have our own kind of social media, professional media. It's called Phil Papers and Phil People. So it's you just type in Phil People and you get this website where all the philosophers have their pages. And if you go to my page there, you can just type in my name. Most of my articles are available for free on Phil Papers. So you can read my work there.
So Phil Papers as in Phil Philosophy, like PHIL?
Yes, yeah, PHIL papers.org.
That's interesting. And we can find you on LinkedIn. Thank you, Matthew, for coming, and thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
Thank you. I enjoyed the discussion.
You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.